Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our viewers from Fiji to Turkey in the Asia Pacific region and beyond. My name is Jose, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this productivity talk organized by the Asian Productivity Organization. Today's Speed Talk topic is demographic challenges in the Asian region. We all know that demographic changes will affect productivity and competitiveness and shape how innovation is created. We could see many aspects of demographic change in the Asian region, from declining fertility, increasing urbanization, gender imbalances, population aging, among others. How demography, therefore, shapes productivity and the labor supply, especially in the presence of older workers on one side and the abundance of youth on the other side, and not forgetting the availability of the female workforce. They continue to be hot topics when we talk about demographics as one of the driving forces facilitating national economic growth and social development. Today, we have an opportunity to explore this topic, especially linking demographic change with the overall productivity performance of the economy. Joining us in this P-Talk, we would like to welcome Dr. Grace T. Cruz, the Director of the Population Institute of the University of the Philippines. Her areas of expertise include the aging of the population, technical demography, large-scale survey research on demography, and Dr. Cruz has over 30 years of academic and research experience in demography, especially on the topic of aging. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Cruz. Would you please say hello to our viewers?
Thank you very much, Dr. Jose. Good afternoon, good morning. I don't know, good night, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us in this Speed Talk.
Thank you very much, ma'am, also for joining us and to share your knowledge on the topic. So our viewers are encouraged to send questions or comments in the chat box for the Q&A session later so that Dr. Cruz can answer them. So now we would like to invite Dr. Cruz for her presentation.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Demographic Challenges in the Asian Region. Basically, what I want to do is to provide a brief description of the major demographic events in Asia, discuss their possible implications, and maybe the policies and programs as a response to these experiences. This discussion is important because demographic and other development factors are closely interlinked. Demographic data analysis provide important insights on other social dynamics, particularly as it relates to health, education, employment, among others. Thus, a discussion of population issues is a good starting point to a better understanding of the socioeconomic and political issues of our society and our region. So this will be the outline of my presentation. I will start by discussing a little bit of demographic trends and patterns in the world and in Asia, their implications, and of course, policy and program responses to these demographic imperatives. I would like to start by presenting the global population trend to provide context to the Asian region. The 21st century is marked by major interrelated demographic events, including significant shifts in population growth and decline, of course, because some populations are declining. We have fertility and mortality transitions, as well as cross-border migrations. At the same time, there's also an observed demographic revolution in the age structure. This is evident in the maturation and the aging of the population structures, mainly attributed to the declining fertility and improvement in life expectancy. So as shown here in the next graph that I will show you is the world's population. And we see here that it's not only growing in size, but there's also a significant change in the age structure, particularly the increasing share of the 25 to 64 age group as well as those in the 65 and over age group, signaling the aging of the world's population. Alongside this change is a more stable number in the younger ages. Asia is an interesting focus because it houses a majority of the world's population. Right now, it accounts for 60% of the total Asian world's population. And this is no surprise, given that two of the most populous countries in the world, China and India, are found in Asia. Asia has a diverse demographic experience. This graph shows the growth rate of Asian countries categorized by regions. While generally we see a decelerating rate of growth, there is not one population pattern. Eastern Asia, which is composed of Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, exhibits the lowest rate of growth, with its population currently experiencing negative growth rate. This is in contrast with the rest of the population in the Asia region, which continue to have high rates of growth and will continue to do so in at least the next 3 decades or so, assuming that the projection assumptions will hold true. Japan and China are faced with shrinking populations. Japan's population peaked in 2008 with 128 million population, but this is projected to shrink to 86.7 million in 2060. China, on the other hand, the world's most populous country, has reached a pivotal moment in 2022 as its population began to shrink last year. And UN reports indicate that India is expected to surpass China as the most populous country this year. The demographic disparity across the countries in Asia region is also evident in the significant differences in age structure shown here by their median age, with Japan having the highest median age at 48.36 years, which means to say that half of Japanese population are older than 48 and the other half are younger than 48. The other high countries with high median age include Hong Kong at 44.86, South Korea 43.35, Singapore, and Taiwan. At the other extreme, of course, are India, Cambodia, and Philippines, which have very young population structures as indicated by their low median age. What's striking, of course, is India, because what this means is half of its 1.4 billion population are less than 28 years old. So that's a very young age structure and a huge one, too. Okay, so one of the major drivers of demographic change is fertility, which is commonly measured by TFR or total fertility rate. This is a measure of the total number of births that a woman would have during her entire childbearing years. Fertility is generally on the decline in the whole Asia region, but there's a wide disparity across the different regions. Again, we highlight here East Asian countries, which have extremely low fertility levels with the region, and it now registers below replacement fertility as early as 1990. When you talk of replacement fertility, it's equivalent to a total fertility rate of 2.1, and it is the fertility required to maintain the current population. The rest of the regions in Asia will continue to have above replacement fertility levels at least in the next 40 years based on the projections. It's interesting to note also that the tempo of fertility decline in Asia occurred more rapidly. No? So there's a faster pace in decline in fertility in the Asian region as compared to the European and other Western countries. Among the factors that brought about the ultra low fertility levels in East Asian countries was the remarkable increase in education, especially women, and the rapid economic growth, which encouraged employment among women. This resulted in delayed age at marriage and lower fertility. In the case of Japan, the shift from marriage to cohabitation became more acceptable and childbearing within cohabitation were rare. The next, this is also another graph showing how many countries and in the Asia region have very low fertility rate and much lower than the replacement fertility of 2.1. Okay, so we move to the next major driver of population change, which is mortality. When the mortality experience of a population is best summarized by life expectancy at birth or the average number of years that a person can expect to live at birth. Over time, there is an observed increase in life expectancy resulting in the aging of the population structures. Overall, we see that females outlive their male counterparts anywhere from 2 to 5 years. And this is not only something that is unique to Asia, but it's a global phenomenon. And the reason why females outlive their male counterparts is because if you look at the age specific death rates, there are more males who die than females across the life cycle. The third demographic process affecting population change is migration. Um, as fertility rates fall, many countries around the world, depend on international migration as a source for stability in their population. In fact, for many countries with declining fertility, international immigration can provide economic stability and help combat a shrinking population. Okay, so this graph shows us the pattern of migration across countries in the Asia region, highlighting the population gainers and losers. Net migration data for the period 2018 to 2021 shows Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia, Japan, and Taiwan among the top population gainers, while Cambodia and the Philippines are among the net out migration areas. For sending regions, economic factors were the main drivers for migration. The volume of migration can be measured in the amounts of remittances which help to reduce poverty by increasing incomes of migrants' families. In the Philippines, for example, remittances sent home by overseas Filipino workers is quite substantial and it shared at least 13% of the GDP in 2005, which is the peak of the share of our overseas remittances. Aging of the population is also a driving force for international migration. This includes trans-border retirement migration, where pensioners coming from wealthy countries like Japan and South Korea are lured to countries where costs of healthcare and services are cheaper. Another well-established pattern of migration is what we call the sunbird migration, a term used for movements to places with a more attractive climate. The foregoing demographic dynamics, particularly the declining fertility and increasing life expectancy at birth, as we've seen, resulted in changes in the age structure that also impinge on development. So we'll see how that happens. So one of the more important linkages between demographic transformations and economic growth is the role of demographic dividends in the process of economic development. As a country progresses in demographic transition, it undergoes considerable age structural shifts. The first demographic dividend happens when fertility and mortality decline, resulting in age structural change, which open a demographic window of opportunity. Initially, a fall in the fertility rates will be translated into smaller number of children relative to the rising share of population of working age. As a result, the share of the population that is working is likely to rise relative to the share that is not working. and this can potentially lead to a faster GDP growth per capita and create room for rising social expenditures. Subsequently, however, with increases in longevity, the demographic window of opportunity will close as the population of working age starts to decline relative to the share of the population that are in the older ages. If the labor force participation rate pattern by age and gender remain unchanged, there will be fewer workers relative to the non-workers, undermining the growth in living standards and the sustainability of social expenditures. The first dividend will last a few decades but is transitory in nature. In the case of Japan, it lasted 47 years, so almost 5 decades. And it's one of the longest opening for the first demographic dividend compared to the other country experiences in the region. So, it starts to close when the lower fertility reduces the growth rate of the labor force and the proportion of the dependent population, the old population increases. Subsequently, of course, their per capita income grows more slowly and the first dividend turns negative. Okay, so for many of the developed countries in Asia, the first demographic window of opportunity has closed, but for many of the young age structures in the region, the window remains open. And so for these countries, population will remain relatively young and the working age population will expand, putting huge strains on the labor market. The challenge, therefore, for these countries with very young age structures is to put in place education, health, and employment reforms to maximize the productivity of their young labor force. By the way, if there's also such a thing as a second demographic dividend. The second demographic dividend transition arises in response to the prospects of aging. So that in countries that rely on capital accumulation to meet the retirement needs of the elderly population, aging provides a powerful incentive to accumulate wealth. This phenomenon has been important to the economic success of East Asia's high-performing economies. But in countries that rely on transfers to meet the retirement needs of the elderly, the second demographic dividend may not emerge. All right, so with the maturation of the population structure, there are several challenges, particularly in ensuring the sustainability of the population's economy and growth. So older age structure, as we know, is associated with lower productivity, and older populations pose greater fiscal burden to governments through increased public expenditure and pension schemes. So, how do we ensure sustainability in the context of aging? Lutz and his colleagues proposed a special focus on human capital development as the ultimate resource for sustainable development. He measures human capital in terms of educational attainment of the working population. In his view, a better educated population has a greater economic growth potential and less vulnerable. Under this framework, it is sufficient to look at changes in population size. It's not sufficient to look at population size and age structure when discussing the consequences of aging. But he proposed a change from exclusively looking at the quantity of people by adding the qualitative dimension, particularly the skills and productivity of the population. So the ratio of the human capital for him is decisive for the performance and achievements of a nation. So here I present some of the two graphs, the one of India and one of China, based on the estimates. that are available here. You can download if you want and look for your respective countries and particular time. And here we compare not only the age, the size of the population, the age and sex structure, but also the education profile of these two countries. Um, by 2030, it's estimated that the population in India will be about 1.5 billion as compared to 1.4 billion for China. And we see here that the age structure is much younger for India relative to China's already aging population. What's significant to add here is the difference between these two countries in terms of their educational profile, with a better profile seen here for China, with almost all of its population, particularly in the younger age groups, already having at least some secondary education, and none of them have, and almost all of them have entered some formal education. This is opposed to the case of India, where there's still a significant proportion there in red, which means they have no education. So, assuming that the ICPD goals will be achieved, this is expected that the future cohort of Indians will continue to improve their education profile, so that these red colors, even these orange ones, will eventually fade into the picture. Okay. So I also tried to look at the trajectory for the whole Asia region in terms of the age, sex, and education profile. And here I provide 1950, 2020, and 2040 estimates. And we see how population has increased in Asia from 1.4 billion in 1950 to 4.6, and now 5.8 in 2040. What's interesting to see is not only the changing age and sex structure of the population, but also the education composition, with the red, the share of the red here in 1950s slowly, diminishing, indicating the improving human capital of the Asia region. Um, I also here present a comparison between Eastern Asia and Southern Asian countries in terms of their education profile. And we see here that if you look at approximately the 2020 period, the education profile of Eastern Asia is much better than that of Southern Asia, indicating the advantage of East Asia in terms of its human capital relative to the other regions in the Asia region. Okay. So, according to Lutz, human capital in the context of aging is the one of the prospects for sustainability, and he states that there's some hope that exists, that the smaller number of young people in aging societies can at least be compensated by better education of the smaller cohorts, and consequence by higher, and in consequence, if they're better educated, then they will exhibit higher productivity. All right, so let's now move to what are some of the policy and program response to these demographic imperatives that we have discussed earlier. We of course again reiterate that Asia is a demographically divided continent. There's a significant diversity in the demographic processes of fertility, mortality, migration across countries, and as well as in their age structures. So, what are some of the policy responses by specific areas? No, okay. So I'll start with the high agenda of developed and aging societies by discussing what are some of the policy and program interventions for low fertility and aging societies. Okay, so in the case of East Asian countries, they have resorted to pro-natalist policies, and this has been put in place to increase the below replacement fertility levels. This includes, among others, relaxing the one-child policy and provision of good maternity leave packages in the case of China. And direct subsidies for childbearing and childcare were also adopted in Japan. So far, and assessments of these policies show that these policies have failed to change the underlying fact that many of these young East Asian people simply do not want to bear their children. So it seems that low fertility is resistant to these policies that are in place. And this seems to corroborate the evidence that we see in Europe, where below replacement fertility is persistent and a long term trend. Europe's fertility has recorded below replacement fertility for over 3 decades now, and there does not seem to be any sign of a reversal. And so some researchers think that the low fertility in East Asia region will remain very low for years unless forceful and innovative policies are implemented. So in the context of aging societies, other policies have been put in place to address their current challenges. And one of this is immigration policies, uh, particularly relaxing their immigration policies or rules to allow more foreign workers to enter countries which prior to this aging scenario have been quite restrictive, no? um, Living another adopted policy that we see is living longer and working longer or encouraging longer working lives. So this program aims to promote employment at older ages as a key response to cope with the challenges arising from population aging. Um, if we look at the data, for instance, on the proportion of those who are 60 years and over who are still working, it's very high in the East Asian countries, precisely because they're already utilizing this approach of encouraging longer working lives to serve as a stopgap for the deficiencies in the labor force. Of course, this assumes that there has to be a promotion of active aging or prolonging the remaining years in active state to be able to maintain them in the labor force. Another policy response is the increase in the female labor force participation rate. So there's a need to incorporate women in the labor force, particularly now that the women, as we see, are better educated. Aged societies, therefore, need most of all an old age and a woman-friendly employment system. This requires reconciling work and family life. Lower female labor force participation rates actually is a reflection of factors that includes large gender gaps in earnings, the lack of family-friendly practices in the workplaces, and the cost and availability of childcare and social pressure on women to leave the workforce following marriage and childbirth, which is observed in many of these East Asian countries. So we need to address these factors that are, preventing women from joining the labor force. Among them, as I've said, is the gender gap in earnings and making, flexibility in the work for women, particularly when they experience pregnancy and childbirth. Many of the Eastern countries are also starting to promote or develop robotics, no, as a way to help in the daily needs, particularly of older persons. And as of course, we don't forget the approach that has been suggested by Lutz and colleagues, which suggests the need for increasing human capital. So I think there's a lot of experiences now and policies and programs that we can see from advanced aging societies, and it's up for the emerging aging countries to take the cue and learn from these experiences to adopt policies that that are forward looking, and age friendly, as they are experiencing a slowly aging, or transformation in aging in their um, age structures. Okay, so how about what are the policy options for high fertility, high population growth, and huge bulge societies? As we mentioned earlier, there's a need to invest in human capital to increase the productivity and advance economic growth and induce improvements in health, education, female labor force participation, as well as national savings and investments, resulting in a window of opportunity for economic growth. So, as evident in the experience of the developed countries, there's a strong interlinkages between marital fertility and female labor force participation rate. Thus, the need to increase the labor force participation rate of women, particularly as I mentioned earlier, there's now an improving profile, the education profile of women. So it will be just a waste if they are not joining the labor force and help in the productive investment of a country. Of course, we should not forget that there's a need to strengthen the existing family planning programs to sustain the fertility reductions that are already ongoing. And I think we are all aware that during the past 2 years, during the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries experienced a sudden drop in their fertility, and many of them even transitioned to below replacement fertility. So there's a need to maintain that momentum so that they will be able to achieve the desired an ideal population size that is appropriate for the development. So with that, I think I need to end my presentation here so that we will have more time for question and answer and more discussions on the issues that were raised in this presentation. So
Thank you very much, Dr. Cruz, for your presentation on the topic demographic challenges in the Asian region. I think it's very insightful to know that, well, in my observation, your presentation, that countries are in different types of trends when it comes to their demographics. So we would like to invite our viewers for Q&A. So we are live, by the way, so it will be good to have an interactive discussion with our speaker, Dr. Cruz. I know that she mentioned that she was able to present all countries, but maybe you're curious enough to know your situation in your country, or you could share, and maybe Dr. Cruz could also give her views. So, Dr. Cruz, we already have questions in our chat box. So please send your questions in the chat box. But before I will ask the question, let me start the discussion with my first question first. My number one question. I think it's a very timely because I think you gave two examples that is India and China. So my question is, so why are developing countries experiencing rapid population growth while developed countries are slowly growing or experiencing aging? So I think your example is India with a rapid population growth and becoming young, and will probably, as you mentioned, will have the biggest population in 20 in years
this
ahead
year, this year,
this year. And
this
China
year,
at the same time is aging. So is there any particular reason why is this the trend in
yeah,
general?
okay. All right, thanks for that question. So, actually, the demographers have this framework of tracing the demographic transition. So we define them as stages. So the first stage of the demographic transition is when fertility and mortality is high. Then it goes fertility starts to decline, and so with mortality. And when fertility stays high and mortality goes down, that's phase two of the demographic transition. It's associated with a high natural increase, and that's when population starts to increase significantly. And then the third phase of the transition is when fertility and mortality stabilizes at very low levels, That's where we are now, as far as the Eastern Asian countries are concerned, where they have very low levels. In fact, some are declining. So if in as I said, there's an close interlinkages between demographic trends and economic factors. So why are do fertility of women decline? Why do they have lesser children? Because of development factors. Some, if you look at women who have low children, it's because they're better educated, they are employed, and as therefore, if there's a program of government that increases the human capital through better education, better health, then women start working, and if they are employed, they're likely to have lower fertility rates because somehow you have to balance work and your childbearing, and that's why as I've said, one of the reasons why the population in the Eastern Asian countries has started to decline is because their women have been educated very well, and they're starting to work, and therefore there has been a change in values. No, they don't want to have any more children because um, it conflicts with their occupation, with their work, you know. And so that's what happens when development comes. No, it's associated with lower fertility. So I don't know, but if that's good news or bad news, because we see now that they seem to be overdoing it with many of the countries, like South Korea, for instance. Women are are not getting married. They're delaying their age at marriage, and even if they're getting married, they don't bear children, and therefore their fertility levels have gone to very low levels. In the case of developing countries, fertility remains high because some of these women, are not as educated as their counterparts in Eastern Asian countries, for instance, and therefore they are, if they are at home and there's no work, and so there's no conflict with childbearing, and also their values, no. We don't forget culture as well, like what are some of the cultural factors that are pro-natalist. There are cultures, like in the case of the Philippines, the Catholic Church that encourages women to go forth and multiply, something like that. So there is a higher fertility of women. So, but as and that's the reason why less developed countries or economies is associated with lower fertility and if with higher fertility, I should say, and therefore if there's higher fertility, growth rate of the population is also high. So
Hi. Thank you very much, ma'am. I think you explained well, and actually, I have follow-up questions to that. But maybe I'll
yeah.
come back to the question that I wanted to ask, based on your explanation. So let me start asking the question from our viewers. So again, we would like to encourage our viewers to send your questions. So we have question here from Amit Kumar. So, what role can the private sector and civil society play in addressing demographic challenges in Asia, and how they can engage to help be engaged to help solve these problems?
Oh,
This
I
is his
think
first question.
Thank you very much, Amit Kumar, for that question. I think the civil society and non-government agencies can do a lot, especially in helping promote, for instance, in the Philippines, or I'm sure in other countries as well, whatever services that the government cannot supply can also be assumed by non-government and civil society groups, no? Like in the Philippines, when the government decided not to provide services for adolescent because it conflicts with culture. So the government facilities do not provide services for young pregnant women. It was the non-government organizations that were providing these services for them. So they can actually complement the government by providing those that are not that cannot be reached by government funds, because we also know that in many countries the funds are not available for all the programs that are required to ensure that all the needs of the population are met. So I think we have a lot. The NGOs and civil societies can do a lot in many areas. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. And I hope that answers the question. And we have a follow-up question from Mr. Amit Kumar. So let me just continue with the second question. So how can policymakers in Asia ensure that the region remains economically competitive and socially stable despite the demographic challenges it faces?
Yeah, and yeah, so there is a need for us to look at policies that will respond to the demographic challenges that we face. So, for instance, we see that in the case of India, no, it's a huge population, it's a young population, and it's the education profile is not as good as the other countries in the region. So there has to be some interventions to improve the human capital of the country. Of course, there's need to respond to the health needs as well. Education, health, and employment are very important, particularly for a very young population, so that you can maximize the productivity of that youth bulge that many of these young population structures are having right now or experiencing right now. So I think the policies and programs should be in place. And as I've said, that there's a lot of good experiences and good practices that are already done by other countries, that all we need to do is to look at them and see what is appropriate for our particular context. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think you also give some examples like policies that are happening in advanced countries, for example, in your slides, and policies that are relevant to or being undertaken by developing countries in your last few slides. So let me proceed with the question here. We have question from Xiev Liang Lai. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. How to
Mhm.
identify one country is old age society? Is there
Okay.
such kind of
Yeah, there
label?
are there are in measures for I had a slide there, but I didn't present it anymore, but because it's kind of technical. But the United Nations, for instance, would say that if at least 10% of your population already 60 years and over, then you are categorized as an aging society. Yeah. So there are many categories, because there are some like that are considered already super aging, hyper aging societies, because about 30% of their population are already in that older age group. So um, there's really there's a definition that the United Nations provide for us to categorize populate whether or not a population is already an aging society.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am. Yeah, I think you give us a very good example, and I think maybe some countries in which population is already in that category is already considered based on your presentation as an aging society. And we have another question here from Andres Ignacio. Based on your presentation, did China's one-child policy have a major impact on its current population distribution?
Yeah, actually, the case of China is a very interesting one, because it had a lot of implications. And it also tells us that when you have policies in place, you should also consider the culture. Because what happened in China is that they had a one-child policy, and at the same time, there is a sex preference, no, right? So there was uh, since there was a preference for males, then and abortion is legal in China. So what happened was that women were aborting their babies when they know it's a female, because if they had one baby, it's going to be just a boy, right? So years later, this had consequences, social consequences, because it created like a marriage squeeze, because many there were many males and very few females in the Chinese society as as an effect of this one-child policy, and that's why years later it reverted back to now it's allowing more than one child because they realized later on that it had severe consequences, no? As far as its major impact on its current population distribution, you mean age distribution? Because right now, because of that policy where there was a drastic reduction in fertility, then the age structure changed because the number of births are slowly declining, and therefore the it changed the age structure of the population, and years later it gave way to what is called now the aging of the Chinese population, where there are many increasing cohort of old Chinese who are getting older, and very few who are in the younger ages. So there is now, as a problem of, the support system. In the case of support system, because there are now lesser in the proportion in the productive sector who are supporting those in the dependent old age population. And of course, this is happening in alongside the increasing life expectancy. So Chinese are living longer lives, and so we have more and more of them living in the older ages, and we have less of those in the working ages, younger ages that are supporting them. So that's why the age structure has transformed into what was originally a young population structure to now an aging, maturing population structure. So that's the major problem now of China. It's a huge population and it's an aging population. So how to deal with that is their main concern.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Let me go back to your explanation earlier because I think I live in Japan, and I think I live in a society where I think, as you explained, it's an aging society. At the same time, you have a very good explanation earlier for my first question. So this is my follow-up question to answer earlier. So we have seen that improving the status of women affects population growth. And I think, as you mentioned about giving them, they are part of the of the people who are employed. So that means, and all the services so that are available, then that will improve their status. But how do we reconcile this with a slowing population growth as a consequence?
You
So when
mean
women are working, for
they
example,
have lesser fertility because they're now
yeah,
working,
yeah,
and
and they have more
therefore,
well educated and they're
yeah,
economically active. At the
yeah.
same time, the society or the population is this. So how do you reconcile that kind of situation?
Um, yeah, so what we're saying is that as women start to be educated, they work outside the home, and then they tend to they delay their age at marriage, which is causing the decline in fertility, and if they give birth, it's only it's fewer because it fewer number of births relative to those who are not working, right? So how do you reconcile this with, so because of the declining births of women who are working, then what it means is that overall the population increase will be less,
Mhm.
right? So if there's less, then overall the population growth rate will decline. So in the case of Japan, because the fertility of women is less than replacement fertility, which means because you need two children to replace the father and the mother to in the next generation. So if women are bearing only one child, then that's below replacement fertility. So you can expect that the next generation will be fewer than the previous generation. And therefore that means that the population will not only, the rate of growth will not only grow, but it will decline. That's which is happening now in Japan. They are not replacing themselves, and that is why the population is not growing, but it's declining. So there's a negative rate of growth in Japan. Same with China. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. So is it good or bad? I mean, like I live here, or not just in this country, but in other countries, advanced countries. I think we can see this phenomenon. But at the same time, I could see that government is promoting, its population to get married, to have children,
Yeah,
not just one,
yeah,
two, and all other incentives. So I think the trend is reversing.
yeah.
So I don't know if it's good or bad.
I don't it's difficult to judge what is a good scenario and what's a bad scenario because when you are in a situation that with a young population structure like most of the high fertility countries, you want to reduce fertility of women so that you manage your population growth because among the three it's really like fertility that's a major contributor to the population change. So so you want to reduce that, and that's why the policies are different when you have a young population and you have a high population growth rate. So you want to manage that population growth rate so that you don't have too many people coming in every year and too many young people to feed, to provide care and to educate, right? But on the other hand, if you're so successful in doing that, then you're starting to have a maturing of the population, and eventually, if that rate will be sustained, it will lead to an aging population structure, like in the case of Eastern Asian countries. And by the time you get there, you have to reverse the policies by from anti-natalist to pro-natalist. So you give incentives for women to have more children. And what we see here, unfortunately, is that it's very difficult to reverse a very low fertility, or that's commonly observed not only in Asia, Eastern Asian countries, but as I've said, it's also observed in Europe. That those that have already below fertility, no matter what the incentive are provided by government, it's difficult to reverse it. So yeah, so we don't know how do you so you they resort to other to other interventions, like opening their doors to in-migration. They also send their older persons to other countries to be taken care of by um, caregivers outside in foreign shores. As I've said, we also expand the number of years so that you can have labor force that will continue to sustain the economy of this country. So it's really a very tricky scenario. Wherever you are, there will be unique challenges, demographic challenges that present themselves, and therefore we have to respond according to the demographic challenges presented to us.
Yes, thank you very much, ma'am. So I think it's a very kind of country specific, but I think in your last two slides, you mentioned about how the government is coping up, and you provided examples given the shortage of labor force because of declining population, and you gave some examples. And yes, so I think I have one question here, another question from Amit Kumar. So she basically he thanked your answer for his two questions earlier. And there is one more question. What are some potential long-term consequences of demographic challenges in Asia, and how can this be mitigated?
Yeah, there are. Well, I think I pointed out some of them, right? When you are so successful in, for instance, managing your fertility, it will result into low growth rate eventually. But in the long run, the consequences of that is that you will have high development initially, but eventually you're going to be faced with certain demographic scenarios that are also not as ideal. Like if you look at countries that South Korea, the Eastern Asian countries, they're so successful in reducing their fertility. So the long-term effect is that they were able to provide development, because the resources were being focused to lesser number of people. But as you bring in development, it also has other implications. That's also because development and demographic processes are interrelated. So, the demographic process that of fertility, mortality, and migration impacts on development, but at the same time, development also impacts on um, these processes. So therefore, you um, you have to uh, take a look at how this interaction can be maximized so that um, the effects or the consequences of your policies will be something that is optimum or something that is um, something that will ensure the sustainability of the society, no? Or the country. Yeah, because long
Thank
term the long term effects could be positive or negative, but again, when they are negative, you have to come in with new policies. If it's positive, then we're going to sustain that, etc. So it's a circular process, no? So
you. Thank you very much, ma'am. I think, yeah, the discussion of this will just like when the time we need more population. So this is what the government was the approach, and then when the time we need to manage the population, so the government approach is like this. So yeah, it's like a circular, as you explained. So, ma'am, I have one question from my side. So, given the factors of fertility or mortality or the disease pattern or migration, I think they contribute to demographic change. If you look back the history, so where should government focus in its efforts to increase or decrease population growth?
so if it depends, right? So if a country has what it thinks is a rapid population growth that is not consistent or is not supporting development, then it has to put in policies that will help manage that growth, right? But on the other hand, if it thinks that the population is currently needs to be increased at a higher level, then that is the kind of response that it should focus on, right? So where should government focus? So it depends upon their specific condition. Where they can focus should be something that is best for the development of their respective countries. So, for instance, if we see, for instance, that the old age structure is not viable because it's too expensive to maintain a very high population, and the working age group is not able to support that old age structure, then yeah, policies should be in place to be able to intervene in the age structure to encourage higher fertility, or if not, encourage migration to be able to support the needs of the population as a whole. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, ma'am. So, yeah, I think it's a very difficult question, I have to admit, because I think each country has a different history of growth. And when it comes to relating development with population, we can see that there were unique in terms of approaches of different countries, even the countries within the region. So, ma'am, let me ask this question. I think because as an Asian productivity organization where we focus on productivity, while you already mentioned some keywords, I mean the keyword of productivity in your presentation, but let me formally ask this question. So, how do we improve the productivity of the labor force in situations with a population growth rate or in a situation where there is aging population, given other factors are constant?
Mm-hmm. So I think I appreciate the suggestion of Wolfgang Lutz to take into account improving productivity by education and health promotion, because if the population is educated and it's healthy, then it's likely that they will be employed and if they will be employed, then you are going to maximize their productivity. So either way, either even regardless of the age structure of the population, I think it's basic that we have to ensure that the population is healthy and better educated. And if we achieve those basic things, then I think everything else will come into place. Like, as they said, the best family planning program is development, because if your problem is high fertility, if you educate those women, you make them, give interventions to make them healthy, they are employed, and eventually their fertility is going to taper, to be lower, no? Because higher development is associated with lower birth. So, that's, and if they are developed in that way, they are educated and healthy, then they are better in a better position to be employed, and they are productive, and therefore not only are they personally benefited from that, but society as a whole will benefit from that productivity
Thank
of
you very
women.
much, Dr. Cruz, for a very insightful answer to my question. I think we have come to almost time with our P-Talk. Time flies indeed. But I know in your slides you already mentioned this, but hopefully this will also serve as your final message to our viewers. So what is the future demographic scenario of the region?
Yeah. I think if all the factors persist as we see now, and if we look at the United Nations projections of the population, for instance, if you look at all those information, they're pointing to a structure of a declining population because of lower fertility, of increasing life expectancy. So we see a future that is declining population size or shrinking population size and an aging age structure. So I think it's nice to realize this, so that if we do not want that to happen in the future, then we have to do something now to make the interventions now, to so that that kind of a future scenario will be prevented. So we've already seen from many experiences of other countries where they are, that they have this is what happened to their fertility, and eventually the population is aging and they have a shrinking pop. If we do not want to go to that direction there, then we have to do some interventions now at the country or regional level, or even at global level, to be able to reverse the trend. But what we see now is that population is going to peak and eventually it's going to decline because fertility levels are generally declining. People are living longer lives because of better health interventions, and therefore you expect the aging of the population to come, and there will be uh, migration. Of course, there will be movements of population across borders to be able to support, because there will be areas in the world that will be in need of labor force, and those that are have the excess of labor force will be supplying those gaps. So that will be the future scenario, and I think we know enough so that it should make us, particularly researchers and policymakers, to think what would be the best scenario for our respective countries and our in the region as a whole.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I thought that was my last question, but there is one question from our viewer here from Andres Ignacio. I hope it's okay that you answer this and we conclude the session. For Mr. Lai, I will please do email us and we'll send you the presentation. So from Mr. Ignacio or Andres Ignacio, the question is within country population. Okay, so within the country, age structures also differ, for example, across provinces or regions. Is it of any benefit to look at this and address these differences within the country?
Yeah, actually, Dr. Ignacio is from the Philippines. So yeah, so his question is it of benefit to look at and address these differences? Actually, for planning purposes, we have to recognize that there are differences in the demographic attributes of local governments, particularly in our country. And because of these differences in attributes, they have to be considered in the development planning. So, um, but addressing these differences, you mean the geographic distribution across the country? Uh, yeah, I think in a way there has to be an intervention on how to, optimize the distribution, because like in the case there's already now the pattern of urbanization where many people are concentrating in certain regions of the country at the expense of sending regions. So there has to be some, and of course policies on migration that will encourage people to go back to where they came from have not really worked out in the past years, because so there, maybe there's something wrong with the kinds of incentives. But I think there has to be a way of managing the geographic distribution of population as well, because otherwise if it will be too lopsided, there will be areas in the country that will not be developed because there are no people, enough people there to ensure that development, whereas there will be congestion in other areas, which of course is not good for or does not facilitate human development. So yeah, I think there's a need for us to manage geographic differences and recognize that as we do planning, not only at the national but also at the subnational levels. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ma'am, for answering all the questions. And of course, we thank our viewers for sending your questions. And sorry to say that we have come to an end of this P Talk. Hopefully that you continue to participate, join our other P Talk sessions and send your questions. So we have seen that different countries in the region are in different stages of demographic transition. As described in the presentation of Dr. Cruz, some countries had already transitioned to aging societies while others are now moving in the same direction with decreasing working age populations. We also heard from her that there are countries that are still in the phase with large working age populations, but will gradually experience fertility decline. Other countries in the region are in the phase of increasing their working populations. However, the challenge is how to translate this into a demographic dividend. I think, as she explained earlier, on what is demographic dividend, by ensuring an educated, healthy working age population and creating jobs for them as they enter the labor force. This will ultimately contribute to overall productivity improvement of the economy. I think she mentioned that relationship. So we thank Dr. Cruz for sharing her insights on the topic of demographic challenges in the Asian region. Now, I would like to ask for her final message.
Okay. Final message. So maybe I just want to remind us all that when we talk of aging, we always associate it with something negative, or we look at the disadvantages of aging. But I want to remind us all that aging is should also be seen in a positive light, because it reflects an achievement of humanity, that we have conquered diseases and disabilities, and that's why we are now living longer lives. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ma'am, and that will inspire societies are aging, so we achieve a good aspect of humanity. Thank you very much, Dr. Cruz, and we also thank our viewers and hope that this talk will contribute to efforts to understand better the implications of demographic change in the formulation of national development policies and programs, especially in pursuing economic growth and social development. We thank our viewers for joining us today, and please tune in to our forthcoming P Talks to learn about different topics that affect the productivity of individuals, organizations, and the economies as a whole. So, ma'am, thank you very much again for your contribution to this P Talk, and to our viewers, thank you very much again, and please stay safe, and goodbye for now.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.